This is chapter 8. We're going to be talking about joints. Joints are also called articulations. It's a functional junction between bones. It binds parts of the skeletal system together. It helps make bone growth possible, and it permits parts of the skeleton to change shape during childbirth. It enables the body to move in response to skeletal muscle contractions. We classify joints by two ways: by their structure, so what they're made of, as well as how they move or their function. The structural classification of joints has three of them. We have fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. Functional classifications of joints are synarthrotic, meaning immovable, amphiarthrotic, meaning slightly movable, and diarthrotic, meaning freely movable. Fibrous joints are held together with dense connective tissue containing many collagen fibers. These are found in bones in close contact. There are three types of fibrous joints. We have syndesmosis, sutures, and gomphosis. The first one is syndesmosis. These are bones bound by a sheet of dense connective tissue or a bundle of dense connective tissue like a ligament. They're amphiarthrotic, they're flexible, and they may twist. The most common example is between your tibia and fibula, and the picture here shows it. So on the left we have our syndesmosis fibrous joint, which is, you can see the green, that's the ligaments between the ulna and radius here, and then also the tibia and fibula. Sutures are going to be the joints between the flat bones of the skull, and then gomphosis are going to be the teeth. Here's the sutures, picture of the skull. They're the joints between the flat bones of the skull. There's a thin layer of connective tissue, and it connects the bones, and it's synarthrotic or immovable. Gomphosis is your teeth, basically, that junction between the tooth and the socket. The tooth in the jawbone is held by a periodontal ligament. It's synarthrotic, meaning it doesn't move. Cartilaginous joints are connected by cartilage, typically hyaline cartilage, or fibrocartilage. There are two main types of cartilaginous joints: synchondrosis and symphysis. Synchondrosis are bands of hyaline cartilage that unite bones. Some are temporary, such as the epiphyseal plate or your growth plate, and some are permanent, like the cartilage between your ribs and your sternum. So that we call that costal cartilage in the picture here. There was our cartilaginous synchondrosis joints. You also have one in the pubic symphysis. This is a symphysis joint, which I'll show you next, as well as in the discs in the spine. So symphysis is our second cartilaginous joint. It's a pad of fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is a little softer. Fibrocartilage is much more dense. This is where we find it at the pubic symphysis, as well as this is what makes up the discs in your spine. It's amphiarthrotic, so a little bit of movement is possible. And these articular surfaces of the bones have hyaline cartilage, but they have this fibrocartilage pad in between. Synovial joints are what most of our movable joints are. They're diarthrotic, meaning they move. And the structure of a synovial joint has articular cartilage on it, which covers an articular end, basically the end that's going to be connecting to another bone. There's a joint capsule also that consists of 2 layers, an outer fibrous layer that has ligaments, and an inner layer of synovial membrane which secretes synovial fluid, which is kind of like a fluidy material that helps keep it lubricated for movement. Here's a generic joint, a synovial joint. If we look at the ends, they're spongy bone, and then on white here is articular cartilage. You also have this synovial membrane kind of wrapping all the way around this joint, and in between is your synovial fluid. Then you have ligaments surrounding to protect it also on the outside. This is all your joint capsule. Some of them, like the knee, will have a pad in there called a meniscus, or a little bit of an air pocket-ish pad called a bursa. Here's a diagram of the knee to the side, and it shows a typical synovial joint as well as less common structures like your bursa and your menisci. The knee is the most complicated joint in the body. You will not be expected to know the parts of it. This is just showing you an example of a synovial joint. So we have 6 types of synovial joints, and they're classified by shape and movement. Ball and socket is a like a spherical joint. It's gives us our widest range of motion. It's multi-axial plus rotation. So our shoulder and our hip are going to be both ball and socket. Condylar joint is the ipsiloidal joint, and it has this is basically going to be giving you back and forth, side to side movement. This is going to be between your metacarpals and your phalanges, so your knuckles in a sense. Here's your ball and socket, is the shoulder and the hip. And here's your metacarpal phalangeal joints, which are called condyloid or ipsiloid joints. The plane joint is also called a gliding joint. It's almost flat or slightly curved. It gives a back and forth and twisting motion. Think of your wrist and ankle joints. Hinge joints is a convex surface that fits into a concave surface. This is a uniaxial, meaning one plane of movement. Think of your elbows, these, and some of the joints between the phalanges or the fingers. Hinge joints, like a hinge on a door. The next is a pivot joint. A pivot joint is also called a trochoid joint. Pivot is going to be rotation only, and the primary one is C1 and C2, or the atlas and axis. They're the same joint. That is, think of your head. If you can rotate your head back and forth, that's because of the pivot joint. The other example is in the elbow, where your radius and your ulna rotate, so you can twist your hand back and forth. So like when you're screwing in a light bulb or whatever, that rotation is caused by the pivot joint of the radius and the ulna. And then the saddle joint is also called the sellar joint. This is basically the thumb and the carpal joint. So this is our opposing thumb business. This is how we can keep your thumb moving to be opposable. with the saddle joint. There's your pivot joint, saddle joint. So joints have different types of movement. The action of the skeletal muscle will produce movement at a synovial joint. There's a relatively fixed end of the skeletal muscle, which is called the origin of the muscle. And the more movable end of a skeletal muscle is called the insertion of the muscle. Movement at a joint occurs when a muscle contracts and its fibers will pull the insertion towards the origin. So here are our types of movement. We have abduction and adduction. Now, because they sound so similar, a lot of times people will spell them when they talk about these words. So abduction and adduction. Abduction means that you are moving away from the midline. Adduction, ADD, think you're adding towards the midline. Flexion is basically shortening the angle. So example here with this leg, this knee joint is flexing. If you think of the leg straight as 180 degrees, if you shorten that to 90 degrees, it's now flexion. If you straighten the leg, you've lengthened that angle, and now it's that extension. Hyperextension only happens in the wrist, and that's a normal movement. So when you have your arm straight out with your hand straight, that's extension. If you point your fingers up to the sky, that would be hyperextension. If you point your fingers down to the floor, that would be flexion. Lateral flexion is to the side, going laterally. In the foot, we have what's called dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is pointing your toes towards the sky. Plantar flexion is pointing your foot towards the floor. Think going towards plants. Circumduction is a rotation. Circumduction is putting your shoulder in a circle. Rotation is rotating your, for instance, this is showing the elbow and the shoulder, rotating it medial, internal, and this one is lateral to the outside. Supination and pronation. In the palm example, here's the supination, palm forward, up. Pronation is palm down. Inversion and eversion, we usually talk about the ankle. Inversion is rolled in, eversion is rolled out. Protraction and retraction. Protraction is sticking the chin forward, retraction is pulling it back. Elevation is pulling the shoulders up, depression is pulling the shoulders down. Over the lifespan of a joint, they'll tend to start to stiffen as age comes on. Many people will develop arthritis, which is a stiffening of the joint. The fibrous joints first to change, and then they can strengthen, however, over a lifetime. They can become a little stiff. Cartilaginous will also stiffen. Ligaments will lose their elasticity. And changes in the symphysis joints of the vertebral column will diminish flexibility, decrease to some water loss, and decreased height. Synovial joints will lose their function as the capillary supply diminishes. And activity and exercise will help with joint function. As long as there's movement, it will help your joints. That is the end of the joint chapter. Thank you very much.